They didn't announce themselves with war, only with presence. Their ships appeared above Earth like reflections from a future that wasn't meant to touch us yet. Smooth, perfect, silent giants drifted into low orbit, casting shadows over cities without firing a single shot. There was no attack, no explosion, no overt violence. Only a signal. Translated into every human language, it rang out across all frequencies, overriding every screen, every speaker, every device. Your resistance is irrational. Your weapons are primitive. Surrender now, and minimal harm will follow. That was their first mistake, assuming they knew what Earth was. They saw our history, our outdated arsenals, our fractured nations. They judged us by our machines. They laughed at our missiles, mocked our tanks, and labeled our nuclear weapons as reckless tools wielded by desperate savages. But the mistake wasn't in their words, it was in the silence that followed. Earth didn't respond. No counter-message. No declaration. No global decision. Just stillness. But the kind of stillness that feels like a coiled spring. They misread it as submission. But what they didn't understand was that Earth never learned to fear the end. It had already survived extinction-level events, by nature's hand, by our own. Fire, flood, famine, war. The planet itself had tried to erase us. And still, we remained. What was one more threat in the sky? For 3 days, their fleet hovered. Observing. Waiting. Orbiting our cities like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to die on its own. But Earth had no intention of dying. Not quietly. Not ever. On the 4th day, without fanfare or visible coordination, the planet struck back. The launch signatures were ancient, almost laughably outdated by galactic standards. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, drawn from long-forgotten bunkers deep beneath soil and mountain, rose into the sky not to pierce their ships, but to shake the space beneath them. Shockwaves and electromagnetic pulses tore through the upper atmosphere. Radiation burst into their shields. Systems flickered. Stabilizers failed. One ship fell from the sky like a wounded bird, crashing into the Pacific in a bloom of flame. Another, its sensors blind, hovered too long over cold waters and was torn apart by a missile launched from a submarine built before their oldest starships were even born. They scrambled to respond, but Earth had already changed the game. Fighter jets screamed across the sky, machines powered by combustion, not plasma, guided by humans, not algorithms. They weren't invisible. They weren't even fast by galactic comparison. But they swarmed. They struck with everything: missiles, countermeasures, tactics born from centuries of real war, not simulations. The aliens tried to track them, but our patterns didn't follow rules. They tried to predict, but our chaos wasn't random, it was experience. And in that chaos, ship after ship began to fall. By nightfall, nearly half the fleet had been destroyed. Not by superior technology. Not by surprise. But by resolve. By a planet that refused to go quietly. The invaders came expecting to teach a lesson. But they didn't understand the kind of enemy Earth really was. They saw our rust, not our fire. They saw our weapons, not the hands holding them. They saw our history, and failed to realize it was still being written. They thought we were finished after the first exchange. The sovereignty believed Earth had thrown everything it had in that initial strike: the missiles, the jets, the crude defiance. But Earth does not fight in waves. It fights in pressure. And the more pressure you apply, the harder it pushes back. The sovereignty brought in the second fleet, larger than the first, and more heavily armed. The sky darkened again as their carriers descended, blotting out sun and hope. They hovered like executioners, weapons charged and ready, expecting fear, chaos, unconditional surrender. But Earth had already made its decision. This war would not end in surrender. It would end in exhaustion, ours or theirs. The first strike came from above, a beam of brilliant plasma that tore through atmosphere and erased a swath of farmland in seconds. To them, it was a show of strength. To us, it was a declaration of total war. Less than 10 minutes later, a torpedo rose from the sea. It didn't whisper, it roared. An aging human submarine, forgotten by time, had tracked the enemy ship and launched a decades-old weapon that found heat, followed it, and tore into the sovereign hull like it was paper. The ship didn't fall, it exploded mid-air. It was the first time the sovereignty realized Earth still had surprises. Then the sky came alive. Not with drones or AI-controlled fleets, but with aircraft. Human aircraft. Loud, flawed, outmatched. But flown by pilots who had grown up studying war not through simulations, but through history soaked in blood. They moved in irregular patterns, launching flares and missiles of every variety, heat seekers, radar locks, dumb fire. The sovereignty's defenses kicked in, but they had been designed for logic. Predictable trajectories. Clean, sharp targets. Not this. Not madness. Earth had always been best at madness. The ships took damage, not from technological superiority, but from disarray. Their targeting systems overloaded with static, their response algorithms corrupted by Earth's crew jamming fields. They watched missiles dodge debris, guided not by AI but by instinct and chaos. One alien gunner reportedly hesitated as two human jets performed a suicide dive straight at his position, then pulled away at the last possible second. The gunner didn't fire. He didn't get another chance. On the ground, Earth's old satellites came to life. Many were decommissioned relics, launched during forgotten decades. But they still worked. Their signals flooded the upper atmosphere, bouncing feedback loops, throwing off trajectory systems and command relays. The sovereignty had expected a digital battlefield. What they got was static, noise, interference, unpredictability. And in that chaos, Earth moved. In cities beneath the carriers, civilians stayed calm. Not because they didn't understand what was happening, but because they did. Humanity had lived through fear before. Plague, fire, bombs, invasions. We had rebuilt from nothing more than ash and refusal. The sovereignty thought they had cornered a species. What they had actually done was awaken one. More ships fell. Some from guided strikes. Some from improvised traps. Others simply failed under the pressure of Earth's invisible war, its ability to fight with confusion, misinformation, and momentum. The sovereignty began to reassess. Strategists, watching from distant star systems, reviewed the losses with disbelief. The numbers didn't make sense. Earth should have broken. Instead, it was rising. And then, amid the smoke and fire and silence, a signal cut through the dark. It wasn't sent from any one place. It had no signature, no origin. It came from everywhere at once. Pirate relays, hijacked satellites, backdoor feeds. The message wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. This is Earth. We are not your vassals. We are not primitives. And we are not done. They analyzed it. Replayed it. Scanned it for weakness, for threat, for bluff. But they found only one thing. Conviction. The kind that doesn't fade when the ships come. The kind that gets stronger the closer the blade comes to the throat. And the sovereignty, for the first time in a long time, felt something they hadn't felt in centuries. Uncertainty. They had expected submission, not evolution. In every world before Earth, resistance had been brief, emotional, and doomed. They believed that when superior force met lesser will, the result was always surrender. But Earth didn't surrender. It adapted. The destruction of their fleet's first wave wasn't an accident. It was the opening of a new phase, one the sovereignty had never prepared for. They watched with growing unease as humans didn't just rebuild, they learned. Every fallen ship was a gift. Every weapon, every scrap of alien alloy, every fragment of burnout tech was collected, catalogued, and picked apart with obsessive curiosity. Not for glory. Not for trophies. For understanding. They failed to grasp the most dangerous truth of this planet, that chaos is not a flaw, it's a feature. Earth had never been unified in peace, but it was unshakably unified in threat. Scientists in bunkers, engineers in garages, hackers in basement networks, mechanics in scrapyards, everyone became part of the machine. Reverse engineering wasn't just a tactic, it was instinct. Old equipment was modified with alien power cells. Broken drones were rebuilt with duct tape and ingenuity. Signal jammers were made from spare parts and driven toward enemy patrols on remote-controlled trucks. Every corner of human society found a way to fight. The sovereignty watched with growing confusion as Earth's resistance became more precise, more unpredictable. The humans weren't just using their own weapons, they were repurposing alien systems. Not copying them, bending them, twisting them into something cruder, but far more dangerous. An orbital patrol ship lost control mid-flight when its navigational software was fed false coordinates via a captured data relay, built from the wreckage of a downed enemy frigate and the motherboard of a 20-year-old smartphone. The sovereignty had protocols for dealing with organized armies, centralized command, and formal resistance. They had no defense against what Earth had become, a decentralized swarm of defiant minds, each fighting in their own way, none waiting for permission. They attempted a ground campaign. Drop pods began falling across the planet, attempting to deploy shock troops and establish control zones. But Earth had already adapted. The skies were filled with thermal noise, chaff clouds, and decoys launched from disguised locations. Ancient satellites were brought back online, flooding orbital space with false signals. Many pods missed their mark entirely. Some crashed in uninhabitable regions. Others were intercepted before they touched ground. Those that landed found themselves not in dominance, but in ambush. Resistance didn't look like armies. It looked like civilians with buried supplies, villages with old hunting rifles, abandoned towns with power lines turned into traps. Sovereign forces encountered opposition they couldn't quantify, improvised explosives, electromagnetic pulses, sonic disorientation fields. They came expecting order. They found madness. And they couldn't control it. Humanity had learned something else too. Fear could be turned outward. Broadcast. Delivered. A short message, one that began as a whisper and became a storm, was transmitted from hacked communications networks. It didn't come from a president or general. It didn't come from any known voice. It didn't need to. This is Earth. We are not your vassals. We are not primitives. And we are not done. That was it. Simple. Cold. Measured. But it wasn't a statement, it was a line. A boundary drawn in fire and steel. The sovereignty intercepted it, attempted to trace its origin, debated its significance. But they knew. Deep down, every officer and commander knew. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a declaration of what came next. They had brought fire. But Earth had not been consumed. It had been forged. They brought their greatest weapon thinking it would end us. The sovereignty called it the Charon Dreadnought, a ship the size of a floating city, capable of turning moons into dust. It entered our solar system slow and deliberate, like a final verdict. Its arrival bent the orbit of nearby satellites. Its shadow stretched across the oceans. They had decided that Earth was no longer worth warnings or diplomacy. Now they would erase it. Not because we posed a strategic threat, but because we had humiliated them. And humiliation, to an empire built on dominance, was unacceptable. They expected fear. What they got was focus. Earth watched the dreadnought approach, but didn't react the way their calculations had predicted. No mass evacuation. No offers of surrender. No final broadcasts. Just movement. Satellites, many long since dismissed as debris, suddenly began to shift. Reflectors turned, signal boosters activated, old orbital junk was reprogrammed with outdated, unstable code. The sky above Earth became a shell of misdirection. The dreadnought saw hundreds of false targets. Ghost signatures. Decoys. Echoes. It fired again and again, wasting its endless arsenal on things that weren't there. Inside the planet's shadow, something else moved. It wasn't a superweapon. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't alien. It was a repurposed failure, an abandoned orbital module originally designed as part of a Mars mission that never happened. Now, it had been rebuilt. Reinforced. Weaponized. Project Thunderclap. Nothing elegant, just a massive coil gun, bolted to what was once a science habitat, powered by 3 overlapping nuclear reactors and a guidance system hacked together from weather satellite components and stolen alien targeting data. Its job wasn't to be clever, just accurate. It fired once. A single uranium slug, 200 kilograms, launched silently into the void. It crossed space in seconds. Not a beam of light. Not a burst of energy. Just mass. Velocity. Impact. It tore through the dreadnought's outer hull and punched into the core, the very system that powered the ship's artificial gravity. There was no explosion. There was collapse. The dreadnought crumpled in on itself like wet paper folding around an invisible fist. No emergency broadcast. No last stand. Just a silence deeper than death. The sovereignty had built the dreadnought to be a symbol. Earth had turned it into a grave. What the galaxy never understood was that humanity didn't fear scale. It didn't fear power. It feared nothing, because it had lived too close to its own edge for too long. And when Earth strikes, it does so not to impress but to end. The skies cleared. The dreadnought was gone. And for the first time, the sovereignty understood they were facing something they couldn't categorize. Not rebels. Not primitives. Not an outlier. They were facing the unknown. And the unknown was human. They didn't announce their retreat. No final threat. No declaration of ceasefire. No dignified bow. Just a quiet flicker in the sky as the last of their ships disappeared beyond the atmosphere. Where once their fleet hung like blades above the world, now there was only open space, vast, cold, and quiet. But it was not peace. It was something older. Something heavier. A silence forged not by negotiation, but by the understanding that Earth would not fall, not now, not ever. There were no speeches, no global celebrations. Cities still smoldered. Families still mourned. The cost was still being counted. But in the quiet between chaos, the world had changed. The invasion had failed not because humanity was stronger, but because it was something else entirely, something the sovereignty had never learned to recognize. Resilient. Furious. And patient. What they thought would be a warning to others had become a signal. Their technology, once symbols of dominance, now lay in Earth's hands, broken, dissected, and reborn in fire. From every wrecked starship, a lesson was taken. From every ruin, a plan. The species they called primitive had turned their aggression into fuel. Factories once shut down reawakened, building not just cities, but weapons designed to defy the void. Military coalitions emerged not out of conquest, but necessity. Bound not by borders but by survival. There was no single Earth government, no unified flag. There didn't need to be. The planet had spoken in one voice without ever having to agree. And now it remembered. Fleets began to rise, not elegant, not beautiful, but brutal. Vessels built from sovereign scrap and earth-born steel. Their engines screamed instead of hummed. Their hulls bore scars instead of polish. They carried no banners, only silence. These weren't warships meant to intimidate. They were promises, cold, angular symbols of what happens when you try to burn down a species that builds its identity from ruins. Signals were sent, not of dominance but of truth. Broadcasts aimed at every enslaved or colonized world across the sovereignty's empire. Not boasting. Not pleading. Just a single message, repeated over and over: they came for us. We are still here. The ripple was unstoppable. One spark on a quiet world lit rebellion. Another broke communications. Another silenced a regional governor. Revolt, once unthinkable, now had shape. And it looked like Earth. But Earth did not seek to lead. It did not offer liberation in exchange for loyalty. It offered only the same thing it had shown the invaders: resistance. The principle was simple: live free, or never kneel. The sovereignty had not just lost a battle. It had lost certainty. For the first time in centuries, they knew they could bleed. That knowledge alone was more dangerous than any weapon Earth had built. Because it spread. Not just through circuits and signals, but through minds. Through fear. And fear was a language Earth spoke fluently. Now the planet waits, but it doesn't rest. Factories stay lit. Pilots train. Code is written and rewritten. No one assumes safety. Everyone remembers. Because the lesson was never about victory. It was about resolve. Earth may one day fall, but not without dragging its enemy down with it. And when the sovereignty returns, and they will, what awaits them won't be desperation. It will be fire,